briefly through like the main definitions of the state. I assume that you actually took this in the Introduction to Global Affairs and the core module at the DPE, the Department of Political Economy, like different definitions and different schools of thought. I'll single out two main processes of state building that they are a little bit relevant to the processes of the context of the state building in the Middle East, mainly the conflict and international systemic factors, and to what extent this would be applicable to the Middle Eastern countries, and the resource endowment, and mainly because the oil-rich countries in the Gulf states, and how the ecological institutional factors would be relevant to the processes of state building in the region. And this is to highlight the importance of the social realities and the intensity, or the how to grapple with the intensity of the social struggle and the sociological foundation of the political elites, or the composition of the ruling class that actually emerged during and in the post-independence period. So this is to highlight the military role and to offer somehow a critique or like hint at to what extent oil would be responsible for like lack of institutional foundation or good governance in the oil countries. But I'll focus mainly on non-Gulf countries or non-oil countries, and we will cover here hopefully Algeria and Egypt, and in the seminar I leave Syria and Iraq to the seminar discussions. And then how the state managed to reproduce its power even after the Arab uprisings. We will focus mainly on Egypt and Algeria, and we will withdraw the analysis to Syria and Iraq in the seminar discussion, and different explanations how state would reproduce its power over like a long period. Why some states managed to reproduce their powers while others actually collapsed or failed to reproduce their power. So if I ask you what the state means, any of you can give me an answer? What's the state? Yeah, this is like the canonial, this is the canon, or the most famous definition in political science, like emanated from Weberian traditions or Weberian notion of the state. So basically they highlight Max Weber and advocates of the Weberian traditions. They bring out the organizational feature or the institutional feature of the state. So lies at the core of this the conception of authority and legitimate use of, or the legitimate use of force, or the monopoly of the legitimate use of force. So basically they highlight the importance of the organizational features and the fiscal or the financial and the coercive capacity of the state, that the state has to deploy all the fiscal or the financial and coercive resources at its disposal in order to enforce laws or to acquire this kind of legitimate authority. Even without deploying any kind of force, the state has to guarantee or to ensure that the population or the wide segments of society would actually abide by or comply with laws without even resorting to the violence or coercive apparatuses. Roschemeyer and Evans actually they highlight the same bureaucratic characteristic or the bureaucratic character of the state, that actually would some organizations or bureaucratic apparatuses invested with authority in order to make binding decisions. So people would voluntarily abide by the laws without even resorting to violence or coercion. Michael Mann as well highlighted these organizational features and bring out the ability to penetrate the civil society or the society in order to enforce laws across the board. Logistically, they have they make political decisions, and they have the ability and infrastructural power in order to enforce these ensure the compliance with these political decisions. We have other explanations. Any other like features of the state? Can you think about like other features or characteristics of the state? This is like the bureaucratic or the organizational feature, basically the extractive capacity and given the rational bureaucratic apparatuses, as Max Weber mentioned, or the monopoly over the legitimate monopoly over coercive apparatus or the use of force. Any other features that would define the state? Yeah? No? Yeah. So the institutional and the organizational character. Any other like features or? So the state only needs like these kind of organizational, the set of organizations in order to make binding decisions, or it needs some other features in order to endure or reproduce its power.
Cohesive understanding of what the nation is or the people.
Yeah, as we mentioned, and as you actually studied, like yours highlights actually the importance of the symbolic repertoires or the cultural framing, which is important for the state in order to communicate some sort of messages and to govern or to generate and reproduce some sort of attitudes, behaviors, and some sort of cognition or understanding of the master narratives, like, it would create this national identity, what we should include, what we should exclude, and how we would develop and maintain this sense of belonging to this territory, the geographically bounded territories. And actually, we highlighted some sort of post-structural explanation of the state. Do you remember what Mitchell mentioned about the state in relation to society? That both are not distinct domains. They are not like separable domains. So the state is not like, freestanding object which is separable from the society. In order to understand these kind of social practices, you need to highlight or to develop an understanding of how the state produced and reproduced some sort of discursively produced effects, the effect of the structure. So it appears that there are certain sets of programs, rules, organizations, regulations, and policies that they appear as a structure, and we need to understand how this would appear as a structure, what kind of social practices the state creates and recreates in order to make these kind of programs, regulations, policies appear as a structure. And he highlights two main practices, the first one, the schooling system, and the legal systems or the rule of the law. So mainly the state, through these kind of issuing or promulgating certain laws, it would demarcate the boundaries about what's permissible and what constitutes transgression. So it would let you, it would actually discipline your behavior, and it would set the moral standards. It's not only what you do, but what's the right thing to do. And the schooling system as well, how the state would actually create this image about territorial sovereignty and this physical space on the map, and retrieve and or instill kind of understanding and organize the way of thinking about this physical space on the map through the education system. And it became like the state actually has become natural part of our everyday practices. You need from the birth to death, you need to issue some documents in order to organize your daily lives. So this is you have organizational features, post-structural explanation of the state and cultural and symbolic reservoir, or the appropriation of symbolic communication or cultural framing. These are important in order to understand how the state came into being and how the state managed to reproduce its power. This is very important because we are going to talk about how the military elites or the state in the Middle East managed to reestablish its political power after the Arab uprisings, and in some countries the state managed to overpower social forces. So the processes of state making, like the most famous explanation in political science, is the role of interstate conflict in order to understand the emergence of the state. So Telly mentioned this famous statement about war makes state and states make war. But this is actually stemmed from the European experience and not necessarily would be applicable to the Middle Eastern cases. So here the major or the main assumption is the interstate war or interstate conflict impinged upon the physical capacity of the state that actually obliged the rulers in order to create extensive bureaucratic apparatuses in order to enhance the extractive power of the state and to recruit, to secure some recruits in the army in order to maintain its existence. And this created some sort of social contract between the ruler and the ruled, because in order to be recruited or to participate in the war, so the rulers had to offer some sort of political rights and political and social concessions as well. But this came in for some criticism, and the historical context of the emergence of the state or the processes of state building in the Middle East didn't fit into this frame of this analytical framework. Can anyone offer why or justification why this frame wouldn't accurately apply to the emergence of the state in the Middle East? Yeah, it emerged actually from this kind of violent anti-colonial struggle in many countries in the region. So not necessarily inter-war conflict, and they had some sort of domestic conflict that didn't necessarily enhance the capacity, the physical capacity or the institutional capacity of the state. So you need, Cohen and his co-authors actually mentioned that it's not necessarily external vulnerability that enabled, the state to build its bureaucratic capacity and rationalized bureaucratic apparatuses, but also you need to highlight endogenous factors and domestic vulnerability or internal vulnerability, what kind of the intensity of the political and social conflict between different segments of society, and this is applicable to the Middle East, and that was very essential or important to highlight, because it happened during the period of what they called the primitive accumulation of the state power. It was the coincidence between the processes of state building and the intensity of social conflict is very important, because it had some sort of weakening impact on the state institutions instead of doing otherwise, as the conflict and international systemic factors would maintain. So we need to understand what would create strong and effective state institutions by highlighting the scope conditions or the conditions under which political leadership would make decisions that would enhance the institutional capacity of the state, and conditions under which political elites would actually the intensity of the struggle between different elite factions would have weakening impact on the emergence, the state institutions or the bureaucratic apparatuses of the state, the bureaucratic capacity of the state. So you need to understand elite strategic choice in relation to the intensity of the social and political struggle at the moment of the state building. And this is what we're going to discuss in the case of Iraq and Syria in the seminar. So like here we need to bring into the analysis the political dynamics when it comes to elites' political choices or strategic choices, and the sociological or the social foundation of this struggle as well. And this is the framework we are going to focus on in the seminar discussion. Yeah. What? Endogenous conflict is not necessarily external, it's internal between different groups. If you did the reading by Mufti, like the one on Iraq, like how different forces, nationalist, Ba'athist, and national democratic parties and different Kurds, how these factions actually and how different elites, how this kind of the fierce struggle, over power led to had weakening impact on the processes of state building in Iraq. So with the another explanation, which is departed from a totally different assumption about the role of the resource endowment, that it had some weakening and negative impact on building or effective state institutions. Can anyone guess what's the assumption, the main assumption here? Mainly oil, it's actually disconnected from the intensity of the social and political struggle at the moment, the very formative moment of state building. So why natural resources would have negative impact on state institutions? Resource curse, yeah. The where what? Yeah.
Because once you extract the natural resources, and let's say you don't very
Yeah.
you can be able to extract from the natural resources and no longer
Yeah, exactly. Because they have this resource abundance, so they didn't have any incentive for efficient allocation of resources, or they don't need any sort of private business to reach a deal for efficient, relocation of private capital. And they have with this easy money, they can build extensive and far-reaching patronage network in order to weaken the civil society organizations, and they don't tax, their people, so that's why they are no longer accountable for them. So they don't build, this kind of institutions that would ensure accountability to civil society or different social forces. And this would lead to the administrative and bureaucratic weaknesses of the rentier state, and this is what's called resource curse. Do you agree or yeah?
Yeah, I think you're getting on the point, but we agree. Maybe applicable to some regions of the Middle East, but in other parts, I think it's not exactly because is it of GCC, the Gulf states, the peninsula itself, maybe Dubai, UAE, and Qatar.
Yeah. So the thing is, we have a range of outcomes that emanated from this easy money or the resource endowment explanations. So why some countries managed, to build, despite the fact that they have the same level of resource endowment, they managed to build effective and strong institutions, while others actually slided into this kind of institutional weaknesses or corrosion. So we have like some countries managed to build like effective bureaucratic apparatuses, and they have like others, they have like a strong networks of clientelism or patronage networks, while others totally kleptocratic regimes, as it's the case in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. In some countries that they have like natural resources, mainly oil. Okay, Ahmed, you want to say something?
No, I mean,
Yeah. So you have like Carl, for example, when she talks about like Venezuela and how the resource endowment actually enabled the private capital to capture the state, not the other way around. So the state, didn't subdue like private capital or private business people. It was the other way around because of the commodity determinism. So if you have like one factor that would explain like two opposing outcomes, so this would undermine the explanatory leverage of the oil. So why in some countries it led to like enabled the state to overpower business associations, while in other countries it was the opposite way around, like the entrepreneurs or the private capital enabled to practice power over the state. Yeah.
I mean, speaking of the resource curse and the internal conflicts as well, like, so is it like, could it be that like, from what we had discussed, like some places like let's say Iraq or compared to like GCC countries, all of these seems to be either emir or, I mean, a sultanate or an emirhood or something like that. So does the monarchy help to stabilize compared to like actions?
Yeah, I'm getting to this shortly. Yeah, let me finish, and Chaudhry actually mentioned something about the coincidence and the sequencing. Like, you need to understand at what moment or whether or not there was a coincidence between the moment of the state building and oil discovery. If that's the case, it would have like negative impact on state institutions, because like political elites, if they have like oil and they have like rich resources, so they don't need, at the moment of the state building, they don't need, to build effective bureaucratic apparatuses. But it doesn't actually resolve the conundrum. Like, for example, like Canada and the US, they have always had, these kind of oil or natural resources, and it didn't prevent, like it didn't actually preclude political elites from or prevent them from establishing effective state institutions. And actually it was the opposite way around in the Saudi Arabia, for example, like they built their own state in the 30s. They didn't actually go through these kind of anti-colonial period, and they faced like the royal family or the Al Saud actually faced fierce opposition from merchants of Hijaz because of the the taxation system, and they had like they resorted to some sort of rebellious actions, throughout the 30s and 40s. But the like oil discovery enabled the family, Al Saud family, in order to destroy, the Hijazi merchant associations, and they enabled them to revise the taxation system and to subdue different state elements or different social elements under state power. So what's the key variables here? We're not going to discuss this in like the Gulf states in some detail in the seminar, but perhaps like as Ahmed mentioned or highlighted, as we focused on the intensity of the social and political struggle on the one hand, and elite strategic choices on the other hand, would enable us understand why, for example, some reformist faction in the military, in the monarchies, why they didn't emerge in order to push through any kind of like building different institutions or intensifying, the political and social struggle. So perhaps we need to understand, we highlight, these kind of dynamics to put the like elite choices or the monarchies or the division in elite circles on the one hand and social realities or intensity of the social conflict and the organization of society on the other hand would help us understand to what extent they managed to build and maintain or change, these kind of state institutions. Okay. So, this kind, in all cases, state-centered explanations are not enough. They didn't help us understand how, certain segments, of political elites took over power or maintained their grip on power at this formative moment of the state building, and how they recreated and reproduced their power. So that's why we need to understand, these kind of institutional choices in relation to, or to put this in interactive term or interactive relationship with social realities, meaning the socio-political transformation, what happened in society during that period, and here in our case, anti-colonial struggle, and how the military emerged as the predominant institution that managed to resolve, what's called hegemonic crisis in society. Like different segments or different elements in society, they went into a fight or intense conflict, and they were unable, to one segment was unable, to take over power or to prevail over the other political opponents, and the military managed to do the job. And we apply this to Egypt and Algeria, and we will discuss Syria and Iraq in the seminar. Oil and the bargaining leverage of dynastic families in the Gulf would help us understand how the monarchies actually maintained, their power. But we are not going to cover this this week, to cover it here. Okay, and then, in order to understand how they reproduced, their political power, we will highlight not only the organizational feature, but this kind of repertoire of meaning, how the state managed to have control over this symbolic repertoire, how they managed to reproduce certain master narratives or national narratives, and this imagined quality of nationalism with application to these 4 cases. So let's start with Egypt. Do you know how Egypt gained independence from the British? Anyone? The terms of, or the dynamics of the anti-colonial struggle. Okay. Do you remember something from last seminar or last lecture? Yeah. So Britain actually intervened in order to monitor, the payment of the debt service, and they had some sort of authority over the allocation of resources, and that happened in order to after the Arabi uprisings in 1882, and it was until after the First World War. I'm not sure if you have heard of the WAFD, meaning delegation. So the WAFD party emerged, out of this anti-colonial struggle, how to gain independence in order to make use of the self-determination principle. So that's why they traveled across a delegation, WAFD. They traveled across the country in order to gain, the signature of the majority of the people, in order to legitimize their claim of the claim to the political representation of the entire population. So that's why, in order to travel to the Paris conference and to negotiate the terms of independence from the British authority, that happened in 1918. And the negotiation dragged on, and it lasted, for 3 years. And this actually led to the uprisings or the revolution of 1919, in order to defend, the WAFD and Saad Zaghloul, the leader of the WAFD back then. And then, with the intensity of this kind of political and social struggle, Britain unilaterally declared the independence of Egypt in 1922, but it was not full independence. They maintained the four reserve points that actually enabled the British to control the Suez Canal, in order to preserve, the imperial their interest in imperial communication, and it gave itself the right, to defend Egypt against any kind of external threats or internal threats, and this to protect the foreign interests there, mainly the economic privileges or concessions emanated from the capitulations. So, but the national liberation struggle during that period was the predominant narrative at this moment until 1930, until 1936, or even until late 90s. The Wafd actually dominated the political scene, and the main narrative or the main component of this national liberation narrative were mainly modernity and the secular elements of this. And this actually manifested itself in literature and in different artistic products. For example, some authors or some novelists, they started to highlight the pre-Islamic civilizations, and the feminist groups or organizations emerged in order to instill, these kind of secular values. And why I'm saying this, because I just want to let you know how the military emerged as the predominant political power that took over power, and how the hostility or the antagonism between the military and Nasser and the Brotherhood reproduced itself, throughout history, and it actually it was obvious during the Arab uprisings and the coup in July 2013. So because of these kind of the master narrative of modernization, modernity, and secular values, and this actually triggered counter-reaction from Islamic groups or Islamic activism. Within this context of this disillusion with the Western parliamentary and liberal institutions, the Muslim Brotherhood actually emerged, led by Hassan al-Banna in 1928. And they grew dramatically. They managed to build some sort of branches across the country in order to offer some social and to provide for some social needs, and they offer some public goods for wide segments of the population. So what they claimed at this point in reaction against this secular and modernity discourse or elements of the national liberation struggle. So they tried to highlight, the role of the tradition or the retreat to the Islamic values in order to achieve progress. And it's not only traditions by making, this retreat to the Islamic values, but they highlighted, some sort. This is from the memoir of Hassan al-Banna. Innovation as well, because according to his writings, he mentioned that the Islamic Sharia or the Islamic laws, they actually emanate from human reasoning throughout history. And in order to make the Sharia compatible with the recent developments, so they had to do some sort of ijtihad or reinterpretations or more efforts with hermeneutics in order to make this compatible with the modern social needs. And in order to show or to fulfill, the goal of social justice, they ran or they established their own enterprises or business operations, and they offer some sort of employment opportunities for some populations in order to highlight that these kind of social justice and achieving some sort of economic progress could be realizable or achievable through Islamic values, not necessarily through liberal and parliamentary institutions that actually came mainly from the Western experience, not from indigenized or local culture. And then they started to criticize the Wafd party because of their political compromise with the palace and with with the British authority as well, and even after, you know, the full independence with the Treaty of the 1963. So this is the context how the Muslim Brotherhood established some sort of power and social basis since their emergence in 1928. And they actually militarized, you know, the society because they had their own secretive apparatuses or organizations, and they engaged in political assassination. And during that period, other political parties, you know, they had like this, like Young Egypt, they had like the same Islamic bent, and they had, you know, this kind of belief or devotion in direct or military actions. So the whole, so you have like liberal and secular elements or forces, feminist organizations, and some sort of like Wafdist and the divisions or factions from the Wafd party and the Muslim Brotherhood that actually offered like the foundation for other radical or Islamic groups to emerge. And you have as well the palace and the British, and you have some factions that they showed some sympathy with Nazi German, like the fascism that emanated in Europe, and they had like, you know, this sort of sympathy, or like they found it appealing, you know, this nationalist ideology. So the whole society was like totally fragmented at this point, and so what happened in 1948, it was like, you know, the performance of the Egyptian army actually triggered frustration and angry inside, you know, the military. And during that period, you know, the free officers as a cell inside the army emerged, and they reached out to some political parties in society, including the Muslim Brotherhood, in order to capitalize on the momentum of Arabism after, you know, the division of Palestine. So this, these young officers, by reaching out to some elements in society, they shared, you know, the same goals by ending, you know, the like putting an end to the corrupt elites, to capitalize on this Arabism as a main source or ideological device for emancipation and liberation, not only of Palestine, but also a liberation of to liberate their country, Egypt, of the near enemy, meaning the palace or the king, and the far enemy, the Zionist and the imperial powers as well. So, like, this is the context, you know, the free officers took over power, claiming, you know, by highlighting these kind of broad elements or broad programs to end the British occupation, to abolish feudalism, to establish social justice or social equality, and to form, you know, a national and popular army, and to introduce healthy democratic life. This enabled them to reach out to some political forces, including the Brotherhood, and after like a short period of cooperation, so the Brotherhood like refused to succumb to the military power, and ever since, you know, they engaged in propaganda war, like the Brotherhood and Nasser, and actually he put an end, you know, to the political role of the Muslim Brotherhood as an organization, and the harshly Nasser and the regime actually harshly cracked down on them. And ever since, they created this national narrative about, like, you know, the role of the army in liberating the country or purging the country of corrupt elites and of terrorists, and excluding, you know, some radical Islamists from the political establishment, by creating, you know, this kind of image about, like, you know, sameness category, and how to relate, you know, to Egypt as a coherent whole, like to be an Egyptian, meaning, like, you know, excluding, you know, these radical elements from the political establishment. Okay. In Algeria, it had, like, you know, a very protracted and prolonged, you know, violent war against the French authority. And they had, like, you know, the society was fragmented as well between traditional elements, ulama, and assimilative or liberal elites that they gained education or they socialized into the French values. And you have as well some liberal and leftist oppositions. But they together, like, the actually, after like a short period of a negotiation that it didn't work out, so they engaged in this armed conflict and guerrilla warfare in order to liberate their country of the French authority. But the main, like the main elements or the common element here was, like, the lack of ideological cohesion or effective communicative system between, like, these guerrilla organizations and local elites or masses. And they have, like, this kind of, they were devoted to the armed conflict or direct action without having any sort of political vision about establishing like a nation state after the departure of the French. And even leftist and liberal opposition, they had to instrumentalize or to resort to religion in order to recruit masses or to appeal to make, the discourse of national liberation struggle appealing to wide masses or wide segments of the society. And after, like, this kind of social fragmentation, the National Liberation Front actually led the struggle against the French, and they sustained, this armed conflict, national liberation inside Algeria and the Liberation Army outside of Algeria. So they didn't have any kind of coordination or effective communication system between both of them. But at the end of the day, some political figures like Ben Bella and Boumediene from the National Liberation Front, they managed to reach an agreement or to negotiate the terms with the National Popular Army, and they had, like, to agree on terms of the establishing of the post-independence state. But because of the National Liberation Army, that didn't have any kind of, it didn't function as a vanguard party with extensive social roots. So, like, the inter-elite divisions actually surfaced or became immensely salient right after the independence. So Ben Bella tried to reach out to leftist organizations and workers. Boumediene tried to reach out to the army, then the National Popular Army and some mujahideen in the army. And Khidr as well, he tried to reach out to conservative Union of Nationalists. Because of this lack of ideological cohesion and inter-elite conflicts between, like, they tried to make, like, this kind of to create an image of a nation state that actually based on socialist, conservative, nationalist, and liberal ideas as well. And this didn't enable, like, it enabled Ben Bella to reach power, or they reached, like, the short-lived agreement. Ben Bella and Boumediene, they reached, this agreement in order to build, the post-independence state right after the departure of the state. But in 2 years, actually, because of this dictatorship inclination of Ben Bella, Boumediene managed to plot a coup against him and he reached out to some mujahideen, like veterans of the war, and some elements or officers in the liberal, the popular army, and some young technocrats in order to build, or to reconfigure the composition of the ruling elites. And ever since, like, the army and these kind of technocratic and the military elites, they formed, the main component of the ruling or the ruling circle or the ruling class in Algeria. But the army actually had to govern. Contrary to Egypt, like, it didn't play any kind of political, like obvious political role. They had, like, it's one of the essential components of the ruling coalition or the alliance between the ruling elites, but it didn't have to govern, politically. So this is, like, can you try to make a guess how this actually resonated with the Arab uprisings, like this kind of hegemonic crisis that enabled the military to take over power and to instill this antagonism or antagonistic sentiments against the Brotherhood in 1950s, how it reproduced itself in the post-uprising period, and how, like, you know, the military that played, like, it became like part of the opaque alliance between some politicians, technocrats, and military elites. It became part of the ruling coalition in Algeria, reproduced itself in the Iraq in 2019. So you see the photos here, like people in Egypt, like they draw a parallel between like Nasser and Al-Sisi, like, you know, some military figures, and they called upon the military to intervene, like in order to box, you know, the Brotherhood in. Just they explicitly asked, you know, the military to rein them in. And in Algeria, so they have, like, here it's in Arabic, not to the Egyptian scenario in Algeria. So they refused, you know, that the military, they sustained, you know, some sort of protests and demonstrations for so long, and they refused, you know, the military to draw or to impose, you know, the roadmap. But eventually, because of the military is so powerful, there they managed, you know, to they claimed, you know, this memory of the independence, that they sacrificed their lives, and that's why they need, like, they were able, you know, to do the same in order to liberate their country or to purge the country of Bouteflika or other corrupt elites. And they rejected, you know, the intervention of the army. But eventually, because the army, it has always played a role behind the scene, the army intervened, and they had, you know, to and eventually, actually, they imposed their terms of transition after Bouteflika. This actually begs a question about how, like, the state would reproduce, you know, some sort of narratives or control, you know, this kind of meanings and reservoir of meaning. Any thought on this? How the state in Egypt and Algeria, and we will talk about Syria and Iraq in the seminar, what enabled the state to reproduce this kind of narrative after, like, you know, decades? People still believe in the war of the independence in Algeria. People still believe in the role of the national liberation role of the military in Egypt. They had idea about, like, you know, what kind of political forces should be included in the political establishment and what other forces should be excluded from the establishment. So you have, like, in the literature, you have, like, two main explanations, like rationalist and organizational explanations. These actually seeping into some functionalist accounts or explanations. Basically, people would, the state would maintain its power and recreate its power, because as long as it has the ability to provide for some services like physical and public goods. It's kind of functionalist explanation, like, you know, citizens would abide by or would comply with the laws and would in exchange to the state, with the state to offer some sort of support and legitimacy to the state in exchange for some fulfilling obligations. Do you agree on this? Yeah, and actually some states didn't provide, like, they imposed some sort of austerity policies and they didn't provide, and they still, like, maintained their grip on power, or they managed to reproduce or regenerate their political power. Some sociological explanations would highlight, you know, we don't care, we shouldn't pay much attention or to the efficiency or inefficiency of the organizational basis or the provision of these kind of public goods, physical security or access to collective goods, but how, like, the state enabled citizens to think about the state as a natural component, part and parcel of their daily lives. So you need to understand habits and routines in order to understand what kind of shared meanings the state managed to instill through, like, the using drama to communicate certain messages, how they reproduce these kind of they controlled, the imagery or the image of what are the qualities of the national identities. So we need to understand this meaning, the generation of some meaning, or the image of the national identity, in order to understand how salient the state is in people's minds, what kind of symbolic understanding or what kind of symbolic tools the state would use in order to define interests, possibilities, threats, and responsibilities, and what kind of the transformative relations the state may have with the society, and this would you can understand this by analyzing, these kind of ideational reproduction of these master narratives or some sort of ideas or imagined will of the nation, and what would represent the will of the people, what kind of political representation, what kind of meaning of the political representation, what kind of forces or political factions would have the legitimate basis in order to represent the entire nation. And this is through analyzing the laws. For example, in Egypt, Sadat issued, what's called the Qanun al-Aib, meaning shameful or law. Like the state, had to define what's moral and what's immoral, and the people, had to people complied with this, because the state or certain political elites have the right, to represent the entire population. What kind of master narratives the state have? The army in Egypt, they have this position, or they have this kind of instilling, this image of the savior of the nation, either from the British colonial power during the 50s, or of the terrorist or the extremist, meaning the Brotherhood and other Islamic groups. So they managed to reproduce this master narratives through filmmakers or other cultural productions, and what kind of debates happened in the public sphere. After the Arab uprisings, if we need to understand how people deliberated the boundaries of the political inclusion and social inclusions, in order to understand what kind of these discussions actually reached the conclusion that perhaps some political factions shouldn't be part of or shouldn't represent the entire nation or the entire population. So it's beyond, these kind of organizational or bureaucratic basis. You need to understand these kind of cultural framing, meaning production, and the qualities of the national identity and political representation. And yeah, you have here some of the works I used to prepare the lecture. And in the seminar, we will discuss in some detail Syria and Iraq, historically, and then after the uprisings, okay? And after the demonstrations, in Iraq as well. It was not included in the uprisings of 2011, but the Iraq or other protests that emerged in 2019, it was considered as a second wave of the Arab uprisings. This is from the local writings. Okay. Okay, see you in the seminar, guys.
It's very interesting, other people, for instance, if you look at these countries, they are not in an external war.
Yeah. People what?
People opt for military to crack down their own people. So it was the same actually in Turkey. A military coup d'etat.
This is what people believe in.
Because they See you in seminar.
See you at the seminar.